Los Angeles, California. Gold's Gym, Venice Beach. July 1969. The sun was hammering down on the boardwalk with that particular intensity that only Southern California summer can deliver. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and turns metal surfaces into griddles. Inside Gold's Gym, the temperature was even worse, amplified by the concentration of human effort, the lack of air conditioning, and the sheer metabolic output of hundreds of pounds of muscle being pushed to their absolute limits. This wasn't just any gym. Gold's Gym in 1969 was the epicenter of bodybuilding culture, the temple where the religion of muscle was practiced with fanatical devotion. This was where the serious men came, the ones who weren't interested in general fitness or casual health. And these were athletes dedicated to transforming the human body into something beyond its natural state, into sculpture, into monument, into proof that human willpower could reshape flesh and bone into whatever form discipline demanded. The walls were covered with photographs of champions, men whose bodies defied normal human proportions, whose muscles had muscles, whose very presence announced that they'd transcended ordinary physical limitations. Arnold Schwarzenegger trained here, along with Frank Zane, Dave Draper, and dozens of other bodybuilders whose names would become legendary. The atmosphere was thick with chalk dust, the sharp scent of metal and rubber, and that distinctive smell of serious physical exertion, not the polite sweat of a cardio class, but the deep, primal odor of maximum effort repeated thousands of times daily. See, the soundtrack was constant and hypnotic. Iron plates clanking against iron, barbells being racked with controlled crashes, the rhythmic breathing of men pushing their bodies past comfort into growth, and underneath it all the occasional grunt or shout of someone discovering their new maximum, their new threshold, their new limit to eventually surpass. Bruce Lee walked through the front entrance at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, and the reaction was immediate and noticeable. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Lifters stopped their sets to look. Because Bruce Lee walking into Gold's Gym in 1969 was like a house cat strolling into a kennel of mastiffs. He wore simple gray sweatpants and a white tank top that revealed his famously defined physique, every muscle visible, where his body fat percentage so low that you could see individual muscle fibers moving beneath his skin like cables under tension. But next to the bodybuilders who populated Gold's, Bruce looked almost comically small. He weighed maybe 135 pounds on a heavy day. The men training around him weighed anywhere from 220 to 300 pounds, and every ounce of that weight was deliberately cultivated muscle mass. Bruce had been invited by a mutual friend, a stuntman named Bob Wall who worked in Hollywood and trained at Gold's for the physical demands of stunt work. Bob had been telling the bodybuilders about Bruce's training methods, about his speed and power generation, about how he'd developed techniques that seemed to violate physics. The bodybuilders had been skeptical, amused, dismissive. Size was everything in their world. See, muscle mass was the measure of achievement. The idea that this small man could have anything to teach them about physical development seemed absurd. Bob met Bruce near the entrance, greeting him enthusiastically, clearly excited to introduce his friend to this temple of muscle. Bruce looked around with genuine interest, observing the equipment, the training intensity, the dedication these athletes brought to their craft. He'd always been fascinated by different approaches to physical development, always looking for principles he could integrate into his own constantly evolving system. "Man, I'm glad you came," Bob said, leading Bruce deeper into the gym. "I want you to meet some of these guys, show them what you can do. Some of them think bodybuilding is the ultimate physical development, that nothing else matters except muscle size." See, Bruce smiled that enigmatic smile. Muscle size does matter for what they're trying to achieve. For bodybuilding competitions, for aesthetic perfection, they're absolutely right to focus on mass and definition. But that's different from functional strength, from combat effectiveness, from what I'm developing. They reached the main training area, where the serious lifters congregated, where the heaviest weights lived, where records were challenged and bodies were forged. And that's where they encountered Harold the Mountain Morrison. Harold Morrison was a legend in bodybuilding circles, though not widely known outside them because his competitive career had been brief and decades earlier. But what made Harold legendary wasn't his competition history. It was his sheer, impossible size. Harold Morrison weighed 420 pounds, not the soft, so unhealthy weight of obesity, but 420 pounds of deliberately constructed muscle mass built over 25 years of obsessive training. He stood 6'6", with shoulders so broad he had to turn sideways to fit through standard doorways, with arms that measured 24 inches around, with legs like tree trunks and a chest that looked like it could serve as a loading dock. His hands were the size of dinner plates, his neck was thicker than most men's thighs, and his presence was so physically imposing that he altered the energy of whatever space he occupied. Harold wasn't competing anymore. At 52 years old, he'd aged out of professional bodybuilding, but he'd never stopped training, never stopped building, never stopped pursuing the goal of maximum possible human muscle mass. He trained at Gold's 6 days a week, multiple hours per session, and everyone there treated him with the respect due to a living monument. He was currently in the middle of a squat session, a barbell loaded with 585 pounds across his shoulders, descending into a full squat with perfect form despite the staggering weight. His training partner, another massive bodybuilder named Rick Santos, was spotting him, though spotting Harold was mostly ceremonial. The man was strong enough to handle the weight alone. He completed his set with a controlled power that made 585 pounds look manageable, racked the barbell with a crash that echoed through the gym, and straightened up with a sound like a building settling. That's when he noticed Bruce Lee standing nearby with Bob Wall. Harold's expression went through several shifts. Confusion, because he didn't recognize this small man in his gym. Amusement, because the size difference was so extreme it bordered on comedy. And something like annoyance, because Harold had been training for 25 years to build the ultimate physique, and here was someone who looked like they'd never lifted a weight in their life, standing in the temple of muscle like they had any business being there. Bob, Harold's voice was deep and resonant, the voice of a man whose chest cavity could serve as an echo chamber. Who's your friend? Bob stepped forward, clearly excited to make the introduction. Harold, this is Bruce Lee. He's the martial artist I've been telling you about, the one from the Green Hornet, the one who's developed these incredible training techniques. Harold looked Bruce up and down, and his amusement deepened. This is the guy you've been going on about? This is the martial arts master who's supposedly revolutionized physical training? Bruce extended his hand politely. Harold Morrison, I presume. I've heard about your training dedication. 25 years of consistent work. That's impressive discipline. Harold looked at the offered hand but didn't shake it. Instead, he crossed his massive arms across his chest, a gesture that made his biceps swell to the size of bowling balls. Discipline. Yeah, I've got that. What I've also got is 420 pounds of muscle. You know how I got that? Lifting heavy weights, eating right, training harder than most people can imagine. Not doing fancy kicks and movie stunts. Rick Santos, Harold's training partner, had been joined by 3 other bodybuilders, all of them massive, all of them clearly finding this situation entertaining. They formed a loose semicircle around Bruce and Harold, an audience gathering for what they sensed might become confrontational. Bob tried to diffuse the tension. Harold, Bruce has some really innovative approaches to power generation, and I don't care about innovative approaches, Harold interrupted, his voice getting louder now, drawing attention from across the gym. You know what I care about? Results. Measurable, visible, undeniable results. He gestured at his own body. This is results. This is what happens when you dedicate your life to real physical development. Your friend here, he looks like he weighs what? 130 pounds? 138, Bruce said quietly. Harold laughed, and it wasn't a kind sound. 138 pounds. Man, I've got dumbbells that weigh more than you. I've got individual body parts that outweigh you. My left leg probably weighs more than your entire body. And you're here to teach us about physical training? About power? About strength? The gym had gone quiet now, lifters pausing their workouts to watch, sensing drama, sensing confrontation, sensing one of those moments that would become a story told and retold. Bruce's expression remained calm, almost interested. You're absolutely right that you have significantly more muscle mass than I do. Your dedication to bodybuilding is obvious and admirable, but muscle mass and functional strength aren't always the same thing. Different goals require different optimization. Harold's face darkened. His pride, already wounded by what he perceived as condescension from this tiny man, now demanded satisfaction. Functional strength? You think your functional strength can compare to mine? Man, when I can bench press 475 pounds, I can squat 600, I can deadlift 650, those aren't bodybuilding numbers, those are powerlifting numbers. Real strength, measurable strength. What can you do? Can you even bench press your own body weight? Bruce was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I don't train for maximum single rep lifts. I train for speed, for endurance, for explosive power generation from any position. Different goals, different methods. That's a fancy way of saying you're weak, Harold shot back. You can talk about speed and explosiveness all you want, but at the end of the day, strength is strength. Power is power. And you don't have either because you don't have mass. You're nothing but bones wrapped in a little bit of muscle. You're probably strong for your size, I'll give you that. But your size is the problem. Physics doesn't lie. Mass matters. Bob stepped forward again, his voice urgent. Harold, that's not fair. Bruce has accomplished things you haven't seen yet. If you just let him demonstrate fair? Harold turned his attention to Bob. What's not fair is you bringing this little guy into a serious gym and expecting us to pretend he's on our level. This is Gold's Gym, Bob. This is where the best bodybuilders in the world train. We don't need some kung fu movie star telling us about physical development. Bruce finally spoke, and his voice carried across the now silent gym with unexpected authority for someone his size. You're right that I'm not on your level. I'm not a bodybuilder. I've never claimed to be. My body is optimized for completely different purposes than yours. But you're wrong about one thing. You assume that because I'm small, I'm weak. You assume that because I don't have your mass, I can't generate power. That assumption is incorrect, and I can prove it if you're willing to test it. The challenge hung in the air like a physical presence. Harold's eyebrows rose. Test it? How exactly do you plan to test it, little man? One strike, Bruce said simply. I'll demonstrate how force generation works independent of muscle mass. You can stand however you want, brace yourself however you want, and I'll strike you once. If you don't feel significant power, if you can laugh it off, then you're right. Mass is everything, and I'm just bones with nothing to offer. But if you do feel it, if the strike affects you the way I know it will, then maybe you'll accept that there's more to power generation than muscle size. Harold's smile was cruel now. You want to hit me? You want to try to hurt Harold Morrison with your little kung fu punch? Brother, I've been hit by some of the strongest men in the world during training. I've taken punches that would put normal people in the hospital. You really think your 138-pound body can generate enough force to affect me? I know it can, Bruce replied calmly. The question is whether you're confident enough in your assumptions to find out. Rick Santos laughed outright. Harold, you've got to do this, man. This is going to be hilarious. Let the little guy take his best shot. Let him learn what 420 pounds of muscle feels like, and then maybe he'll go back to making his TV shows and leave real physical training to real athletes. Harold considered for a moment, looking at Bruce with an expression mixing contempt and curiosity. He was clearly certain this would end with Bruce embarrassed, with this tiny martial artist learning a painful lesson about the reality of mass and power. Fine, Harold said. One strike. Give me your best shot. Show all these people your magical kung fu power that supposedly overcomes physics and biology, but when this doesn't work, when you hurt your hand punching me and I don't feel a thing, I want you to admit that everything you teach is just movie nonsense. Agreed? Agreed, Bruce said. Where would you like me to strike? Your choice, Harold gestured broadly at his massive torso. Anywhere you think you can affect me. I'll even help you out. I won't tense up or defend. I'll just stand here and let you hit me with everything you've got. The crowd had grown significantly now. Word had spread through Gold's Gym that something was happening. And at least 40 bodybuilders had gathered around, forming a circle, every one of them massive, every one of them clearly expecting to see Bruce Lee humiliated, to see this small man learn the hard way that muscle mass was the ultimate physical achievement. Bob Wall looked worried, leaning close to Bruce. Bruce, this guy outweighs you by 280 pounds. He's got muscle density you can't even imagine. Are you sure about this? Bruce's smile was calm and certain. I'm very sure. Trust me. Harold took a position in the center of the circle, standing square and stable, arms at his sides, his massive chest thrust forward almost mockingly. Come on then, little man. Take your shot. Let's see this power generation you're so proud of. Bruce walked toward Harold slowly, and the size difference became even more absurd at close range. Harold's chest was at Bruce's eye level. Bruce's entire torso would fit inside Harold's ribcage with room to spare. It looked like a child preparing to punch an adult, except both men were clearly serious. The tension in that gym absolutely electric. Bruce studied Harold for a moment, assessing, calculating. Then he raised his right hand and placed his fist against Harold's solar plexus, that vulnerable point just below the sternum where the ribcage ends and the diaphragm attaches. 1 inch of space between my fist and contact point, Bruce said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm going to generate force using full body mechanics, transferring kinetic energy from the ground through my entire structure and focusing it on this single point. This is called the 1-inch punch. Mass doesn't matter for this technique. In leverage and energy transfer matter. Several bodybuilders in the crowd laughed. One of them called out, "This I gotta see." Another shouted, "Harold, try not to laugh too hard when he tickles you." Harold's expression was pure condescension. "Whenever you're ready, Professor. Teach me about energy transfer." Bruce's entire body shifted. It wasn't a wind-up, wasn't a telegraph, wasn't any kind of obvious preparation. It was like watching a wave travel through water, starting from his back foot, rising through his legs, transferring through his hip rotation, amplifying through his core engagement, channeling through his shoulder, and finally expressing itself through his fist in a short, sharp, devastating pulse. The sound was like a gunshot in the enclosed space, sharp and violent and completely unexpected. Harold Morrison's eyes went wide. Russ, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face went from smug superiority to absolute shock in the span of a microsecond. His massive body, all 420 pounds of deliberately constructed muscle mass, lifted slightly off the ground, actually left the floor from a 1-inch strike, and traveled backward 4 feet before his legs remembered how to work. He stumbled, caught himself on a weight rack, both hands flying to his midsection, his breathing suddenly labored and desperate, his face showing pain and confusion and something close to fear. The gym exploded in shocked exclamations. Bodybuilders who'd been laughing seconds ago were now staring in disbelief. Someone shouted, "What the hell?" Another voice, "That's not possible." A third, "Did you see that? Did you see him move?" Rick Santos rushed to Harold's side. "Harold, you okay, man? Talk to me." Harold was trying to breathe, his diaphragm completely frozen by the precise strike to his celiac plexus, his nervous system overwhelmed, his body's autonomic functions temporarily disrupted. His face had gone pale, sweat breaking out across his forehead, his legendary physical conditioning suddenly irrelevant in the face of a technique that targeted function rather than structure. After about 20 seconds that felt like an eternity to Harold, he managed to draw a gasping, shallow breath. Then another. Slowly, painfully, his respiratory system rebooted, his body reluctantly remembering how to perform its most basic function. The entire sequence, from Bruce placing his fist against Harold's solar plexus to Harold stumbling backward, clutching his midsection, took 6 seconds. Maybe less. Bruce hadn't moved from his position. He stood exactly where he'd been, his expression showing concern rather than triumph, watching Harold recover, waiting patiently to ensure the massive bodybuilder was okay. "What did you do to me?" Harold's voice was hoarse, barely audible over the shocked discussions erupting throughout the gym. His hand was still pressed against his solar plexus, his face still showing traces of the pain and shock. "I struck your celiac plexus with focused kinetic energy," Bruce explained, his tone educational rather than boastful. The celiac plexus is a nerve cluster located behind the solar plexus. When struck correctly, it sends a signal to your diaphragm to contract involuntarily. Your nervous system interprets this as a threat and temporarily shuts down your breathing as a protective response. Your muscle mass didn't protect you because I wasn't attacking your muscles. I was attacking your nervous system. "But I felt it coming," Harold protested, still struggling to fully comprehend what had happened. "I felt you move. I just couldn't..." "Couldn't what?" Bruce finished. "Couldn't defend against it? Couldn't redirect it? That's because the technique is designed to work faster than your defensive reflexes can respond. By the time your nervous system recognized the threat and attempted to signal your muscles to tense, The strike had already landed and achieved its purpose. The crowd was going insane now, 40 massive bodybuilders all talking at once, arguing about what they'd witnessed, trying to reconcile what they'd seen with their fundamental understanding of how strength and power worked. Treat it if you're watching this story and learning something about Bruce Lee you never knew before. If this is showing you a side of physical training and power generation that challenges everything you thought you understood, do me a favor right now and hit that subscribe button. Because there are dozens more true stories like this, documented accounts of Bruce Lee demonstrating principles that seemed impossible, and you don't want to miss them. One of the bodybuilders in the crowd, a competitive heavyweight named Dave Matthews, pushed forward. Okay, that was impressive, I'll admit. But Harold wasn't defending himself. He was just standing there. Maybe if he'd been ready, if he'd tensed his core muscles, it would have been different. Bruce turned to look at Dave. You're welcome to test that theory. I'll give you the same demonstration. One, you can tense, you can defend, you can do whatever you think will protect you. The result will be the same. Dave hesitated, clearly having second thoughts now that he'd seen what happened to Harold, but his pride and the pressure of 40 witnesses made retreat impossible. All right, he said, stepping into the center of the circle. But I'm tensing everything. I'm going to make my core as hard as possible. Bruce nodded. That's fine. In fact, tensing might make it worse. When your muscles are rigid, they can't dissipate force effectively. They become a conductor for the energy rather than an absorber. Dave positioned himself, and you could see every muscle in his torso contract, his six-pack abs becoming so defined they looked carved from granite, his obliques standing out in sharp relief, his entire core turned into armor. So Bruce placed his fist against the same target point, 1 inch of space, the same setup. Ready? Bruce asked. Dave nodded, his jaw clenched, his entire body rigid with tension and determination. Bruce's body shifted with that same wave-like motion, and his fist drove forward with that same sharp pulse of focused energy. The impact was even more dramatic than with Harold. Dave's tensed muscles provided no protection whatsoever. In fact, as Bruce had predicted, the rigidity of his core seemed to amplify the effect. Dave's entire body convulsed, his carefully maintained tension collapsing instantly, his hands flying to his midsection, a sound escaping his throat that was half gasp, half groan. He stumbled backward 6 feet, hit a bench, and sat down hard, his face a mask of shock and pain, his breathing as disrupted as Harold's had been. See, the gym had gone from noisy chaos to stunned silence. These were men who dedicated their lives to building the ultimate physiques, to maximizing muscle mass and strength, to pushing the human body to its absolute limits. And they'd just watched 2 of their largest, strongest members get defeated in seconds by a man who weighed less than 140 pounds using a technique that made their carefully constructed muscle mass completely irrelevant. And if you're enjoying this story, if you're fascinated by these real accounts of Bruce Lee's actual abilities, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people discover the truth about Bruce Lee beyond the movies and the legend. Bob Wall was grinning now, vindicated after weeks of his stories being dismissed by the bodybuilding community. I tried to tell you guys. I tried to explain that Bruce has developed something different, something that doesn't depend on muscle size, but you had to see it to believe it. Bruce walked over to where Harold was standing, still recovering, still processing what had happened to him. Harold looked down at Bruce, and his expression had completely changed. The condescension was gone, replaced by genuine respect and professional curiosity. "How is that possible?" Harold asked, his voice still slightly strained. "I've got muscle protecting my core. I've got body mass that should absorb impact. How does a 138-pound man generate enough force to affect me like that?" "Because force and mass aren't the same thing," Bruce explained. "You've built your body for maximum size and aesthetic perfection. That's impressive and valid for your goals. But I've built my body for maximum efficiency in force transfer. Watch." Bruce positioned himself in his neutral stance. Power generation starts from the ground. He shifted his weight slightly, and you could see his rear foot engage. The force travels up through the leg, transfers through the hip rotation, amplifies through core engagement, and expresses through the arm. Each segment of the kinetic chain adds energy, and all of that energy gets focused into a single point of impact. He placed his hand against Harold's chest again, but this time in slow motion, showing the wave of motion traveling through his body. Your muscle mass is distributed across your entire frame. My force is concentrated into an area about the size of a quarter. The pressure per square inch at the point of impact can exceed what your muscle can absorb or distribute, especially when I'm targeting a neurological cluster rather than just trying to cause blunt force trauma. Harold was nodding slowly, his professional mind working through the implications. So all these years I've been building mass, thinking bigger meant stronger, more powerful, but you're saying I've been optimizing for the wrong variable. Not wrong, Bruce corrected. Different. For bodybuilding, for aesthetics, for the goals you've set, muscle mass is exactly the right variable to optimize. But for combat, for functional power in fighting applications, mass is just one factor among many. Speed, timing, precision, understanding of human anatomy, these can matter more than size. Aunt Dave Matthews had recovered enough to join the conversation, walking over slowly, still holding his solar plexus. Bruce, I've been lifting weights for 12 years. I can bench 425 pounds. I've got a physique that's won regional competitions. And you just shut down my entire body with what looked like a light push. How do I learn to do that? Before Bruce could answer, a dozen voices joined in. Bodybuilders who moments ago had been mocking this small man, now desperate to understand his methods, to learn his techniques, to access knowledge that had just proven itself more effective than everything they'd been taught. Bruce looked around at all these massive athletes, these dedicated trainers who'd spent years building their bodies according to one philosophy, are now suddenly confronted with a completely different approach that had proven devastatingly effective. What I teach isn't something you can add to your existing training, he said carefully. It requires rethinking your fundamental assumptions about power, about strength, about how the body generates and applies force. Most of you have spent years building maximum muscle mass. What I'm talking about is efficiency, economy of motion, precise targeting. It's a different paradigm entirely. I want to learn it, Harold said, and his voice carried the weight of genuine humility. I came here today thinking I understood physical development, thinking my 25 years of training had taught me everything worth knowing about the human body. You just proved I was wrong in 6 seconds. If you're willing to teach, I'm willing to learn. Rick Santos spoke up. Harold, you're really going to train with this guy? After he just embarrassed you in front of everyone? Harold turned to look at his training partner. Rick, he didn't embarrass me. He educated me. There's a difference. I've been pursuing maximum muscle mass my entire adult life, thinking that was the ultimate expression of physical achievement. He just showed me there are dimensions of physical training I never explored, never even knew existed. That's not embarrassing, that's enlightening. One of the other bodybuilders, a younger competitor named Phil Stevens, raised his hand like he was in school. Bruce, I have a question. If muscle mass doesn't matter for what you're doing, why do you look so defined? Why have any muscle at all? Muscle absolutely matters, Bruce clarified. See, but the type of muscle and how you develop it matters more than the total amount. I train for explosive, fast-twitch muscle fiber, for endurance, for flexibility. Every ounce of muscle on my body has a functional purpose. Nothing is there just for show. Whereas bodybuilding often develops muscle beyond functional necessity for aesthetic purposes. Neither approach is wrong. They're just optimized for different goals. Can you demonstrate the technique again? Dave Matthews asked. Maybe in slow motion so we can see the mechanics? Bruce nodded and asked for a volunteer. A medium-sized bodybuilder named Tom Chen stepped forward, Chinese-American like Bruce, clearly excited to participate. Bruce positioned him and went through the motion in extreme slow motion, explaining each phase of the kinetic chain, showing how his rear foot engaged, how his knee drove forward, how his hip rotated, how his core amplified the rotational force, how his shoulder channeled it, and how all of that energy expressed through his fist in a controlled pulse. The bodybuilders watched with absolute focus. These men who'd thought they understood biomechanics suddenly realizing they'd been studying only one type of movement pattern, only one application of force generation. Their training had made them experts in slow, controlled, heavy lifting. Bruce was showing them explosive, instantaneous, precise force application. Completely different skills, both valid, both effective for their respective purposes. Bob Wall spoke up. "Bruce, show them the finger push-up." The crowd looked skeptical again. Several people laughed, thinking this was a joke. "Finger push-ups?" one of the heavyweights said mockingly. "Man, we do push-ups with 300 pounds on our backs. What's a finger push-up going to prove?" Bruce walked to an open area of floor and took a push-up position, but instead of using his palms, he positioned his body weight on just the thumb and index finger of each hand. Then he performed 12 perfect push-ups, his body rigid as a plank, lowering until his chest nearly touched the floor and pressing back up with control, all his weight balanced on 4 fingers. The gym erupted in amazed exclamations. Several bodybuilders immediately tried to replicate it and failed spectacularly, their fingers buckling, their wrists collapsing, their much larger bodies unable to maintain the balance and tendon strength required. "That's not about muscle size," Bruce explained, standing up easily. "That's about tendon conditioning, finger strength, core stability, knee and body control. You could add 50 pounds of muscle mass and still not be able to do it because it's a different type of physical development. If you've made it this far into this story, if you're still engaged and learning, I want to ask you something. Leave a comment below telling me what surprised you most. Was it the 1-inch punch affecting a 420-pound bodybuilder? The fact that tensing up made the technique worse? The philosophical approach to different types of strength? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know what resonates with you." Harold Morrison sat down on a nearby bench, his mind clearly racing through implications and realizations. He looked at his massive arms, his huge chest, the physique he'd spent 25 years building, and for the first time in decades, knew he was questioning whether he'd been pursuing the right goals, whether muscle mass was truly the ultimate achievement he'd always believed it to be. Bruce sat down next to him, and the size difference was almost comical, this small man next to this massive human mountain. "You've accomplished something remarkable," Bruce said quietly. "The discipline, the consistency, the dedication required to build what you've built, that's genuinely impressive. Don't let today make you think your work was wasted or wrong." Harold looked at him. "But you just proved that my size doesn't matter, that all this muscle I've built can't protect me from someone who understands techniques I never learned." "It matters for your goals," Bruce insisted. "If your goal is bodybuilding competition, aesthetic perfection, maximum muscle mass, then you've succeeded. You've optimized brilliantly for that purpose. My techniques are optimized for a completely different purpose, for combat, for fighting. Different tools for different jobs. Neither is superior in absolute terms. They're superior for specific applications." "But you can beat me," Harold said bluntly. "In a real confrontation, you'd win despite being 280 pounds smaller. In unarmed combat with no rules, probably yes," Bruce admitted. "But put us in a bodybuilding competition and I'd lose spectacularly. Put us in a strength competition and you'd destroy me. Context matters. Purpose matters. You can't judge effectiveness without defining what you're trying to be effective at." The conversation continued for another hour, Bruce conducting an impromptu seminar right there in Gold's Gym. The temple of bodybuilding becoming a classroom for principles that most of these athletes had never encountered. He demonstrated speed drills, showing how he trained his reflexes to respond in fractions of a second. He explained the difference between slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fiber, between strength and power, between maximum force and explosive force. He showed them flexibility exercises that made these massive men, many of whom could barely touch their toes, stare in amazement as Bruce performed full splits and complex stretches that seemed to ignore normal joint limitations. And through it all, he maintained a tone of respect and humility, never claiming superiority, always framing the discussion as different approaches to different goals. We're always acknowledging the impressive achievements these bodybuilders had accomplished within their chosen discipline. Before we finish this story, I need to ask you for one more favor. If you found this valuable, if you learned something about Bruce Lee, or about physical training, or about power generation, please share this video. Send it to someone who lifts weights, who does martial arts, who's interested in bodybuilding or combat sports. Sharing helps preserve these real stories and spread these lessons to people who need to hear them. Harold Morrison became one of Bruce's most unlikely students. For the next 3 years, until Bruce's death in 1973, Harold would make the trip from Venice Beach to Bruce's school in Chinatown twice a month. This massive bodybuilder learning explosive techniques from a man 1/3 his size. He integrated what he learned into his training, not abandoning bodybuilding, but supplementing it with functional power development, with speed work, with flexibility training. His physique actually decreased slightly in total mass, dropping from 420 to 395 pounds, but his functional strength and explosive power increased dramatically. He would later say that the 6 seconds in Gold's Gym were the most important 6 seconds of his training life, the moment when he realized that everything he thought he knew about physical development was incomplete. Dave Matthews had a similar transformation, and several other Gold's regulars began incorporating elements of Bruce's training into their routines. The gym became one of the few places where you'd see massive bodybuilders practicing explosive strikes, working on flexibility, on training reflexes alongside their traditional heavy lifting. The story spread through the bodybuilding community like wildfire, becoming one of those legends that gets told and retold, sometimes accurately, often with embellishments. Some versions claimed Bruce sent Harold flying across the gym. Others said he used a secret pressure point technique. A few insisted it was all choreographed, that Harold had faked the reaction for publicity. But the 40 bodybuilders who were actually there, who witnessed it firsthand, who saw the immediate, unmistakable physical reaction, they knew exactly what had happened. They'd seen their fundamental assumptions about strength and power challenged and defeated in 6 seconds. Arnold Schwarzenegger heard about it. He trained at Gold's regularly, though he wasn't there that particular day, and he sought out Bruce personally to learn more. Their training sessions would become legendary in their own right, the future Mr. Olympia learning explosive techniques from the martial artist, both men recognizing that the other had developed expertise in different but valuable dimensions of physical training. Years later, after Bruce's death, Harold Morrison was interviewed for a martial arts documentary. The interviewer asked him about that day in 1969, about how it felt to be so thoroughly affected by someone so much smaller. Harold's answer was characteristically honest and insightful. "I came to that gym every day for 25 years thinking I understood strength. I'd built the biggest body I could possibly build, I could lift weights that would crush normal men, and I thought that made me as powerful as a human being could be. Then Bruce Lee touched my chest with one finger and showed me I understood maybe 20% of what real power meant. He didn't have my muscle mass, didn't have my size, didn't have my weightlifting numbers. But he understood force generation, energy transfer, precision targeting at a level that made my advantages irrelevant. That wasn't humiliating. That was the greatest gift anyone ever gave me in a gym. He freed me from my ignorance, showed me there was so much more to learn, so many dimensions of physical training I'd never explored. I'd relive those 6 seconds 1,000 times for the lessons they taught me." The documentary included footage of Harold, still massive in his late 60s, demonstrating some of the techniques Bruce had taught him, explosive strikes that seemed impossible from a man his size, speed that defied his bulk, and precision that came from decades of practice integrating what he'd learned. Gold's Gym continued to be the epicenter of bodybuilding culture, and champions continued to train there, building physiques that pushed the boundaries of human muscular development. But after that day in July 1969, there was always an undercurrent of awareness that muscle size, while impressive and valuable, was only one dimension of physical capability, that strength had multiple definitions, that power could manifest in ways beyond just lifting heavy weights. And before I finish, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button one final time. Because Bruce Lee's story is filled with moments like this, with 6-second exchanges that carried lifetime lessons, with demonstrations that challenged fundamental assumptions, or even with humble teachings that transformed understanding. The legacy of those 6 seconds extends far beyond what happened in that gym. It represented a meeting point between two different philosophies of physical development, between aesthetics and function, between maximum size and maximum efficiency. Neither philosophy was proven wrong, both were proven incomplete, and from that incompleteness came growth, evolution, integration. Bruce Lee weighed 138 pounds. Harold Morrison weighed 420 pounds. By every conventional measure of strength and power in 1969, Harold should have been vastly superior. He was bigger, he was stronger in traditional metrics, he had more muscle mass than seemed possible on a human frame. But in 6 seconds, Bruce demonstrated that power has dimensions that muscle mass alone cannot address. That, understanding biomechanics, targeting vulnerabilities, generating explosive force through kinetic chain optimization, these could overcome massive physical disadvantages. Not through magic, not through tricks, but through principles that were scientifically sound, practically effective, and reproducible for anyone willing to learn them. Harold Morrison stood in Gold's Gym, the temple he'd worshipped in for 25 years, and learned that his gods were smaller than he'd believed, that there were other temples, other gods, other truths worth pursuing. And he did something that marks true wisdom. He set aside his ego, acknowledged his incomplete understanding, and became a student again. 6 seconds that changed everything. Not just for Harold, not just for the bodybuilders who witnessed it, but for everyone who heard the story, and who learned the lesson, who realized that strength comes in forms we don't always recognize, that power can be cultivated through paths we haven't explored, that the ultimate physical development might not be in any single discipline, but in the integration of multiple approaches. Bruce Lee walked into Gold's Gym weighing 138 pounds and walked out the same weight. But he left behind something heavier. The knowledge that everything these dedicated athletes thought they knew was only part of the truth, and that the rest of the truth, the parts they'd never explored, might be more powerful than everything they'd already mastered. 6 seconds, 1 inch, 138 pounds defeating 420 pounds. Not through violation of physics, but through understanding physics better than anyone else in that room. That's the real story of what happened in Gold's Gym in July 1969. Not a small man beating a large man, but a master showing students they didn't know they were students, teaching lessons they didn't know they needed, opening doors they didn't know existed. And on the other side of those doors was a bigger world than they'd imagined.